sure if I'm here. It's the 25th of 24th of.
You know our friends Danny and Katrina? Frank?
If there's a tip jar, it might just be family friends.
Good day.
Yeah. I spent the morning with Philbrook actually.
Really?
Eating bagels and coffee over something.
Oh, it's a long, long while from May to December, but the days grow short when you reach September, when the autumn weather turns the leaves to flame. One hasn't got time for the waiting game. Oh, the days dwindle down to a precious few. September, November, and these few precious days I'll spend with you. These precious days I'll spend with you. precious you. September, November, and these few precious days I'll spend with you. These precious days I'll spend with you. I'll spend with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim. I was a friend of Bill's. I want to welcome you to the Historic Poetry Project as we celebrate the life of Bill and all his friends. I'd like to thank everyone here at the Poetry Project for all their hard work. Larry Rivers might have said this in this room. He said of Frank O'Hara, when he died, there were 60 people who felt like Frank was their best friend. Brian Eno once allegedly said of the Velvet Underground, they didn't sell very many records, but everyone who bought one started a band. The poet Bill Corbett had this kind of effect on everyone who encountered him. For every reader who was tuned into his work, he made you want to spring up from the page and go write yourself. And if you met Bill, you ended up eventually getting adopted into an affable crowd of admirers, students, rogues, colleagues, painters, poets, jokers, and pals. I called him Big Bill. His voice boomed, his generosity of spirit and largest of character abounded. He was quick to kid and prod, always had great advice, and had read everything. I think they stopped having parties at Bill's house because he lost too many of his books. Bill was an aficionado of friendships, a believer in putting people at the same dinner table, telling them exactly who to sit next to, and watching the sparks fly. His literary laboratory at 9 Columbus Square in Boston, the house he and Beverly and his family shared for more than 40 years, was one of the most important places in my life, and I know many of the people here. Pulitzer Prize winner and house sitter Jhumpa Lahiri started writing short stories there. Lewis Warsh typed up John Wiener's The Hotel Wentley poems, Notebook. The Journal of John Wiener's is to be called 707 Scott Street for Billie Holiday one summer. And untold millions of came for Beverly Corbett's cooking and left that brownstone feeling sparked in some direction or another. Upon leaving, one felt full, inspired, and like one belonged to something bigger. Bill was a charismatic ringleader of a never-ending literary salon that brought great writers from all over to read in Boston, break bread, and polish off a few. And he treated even lowly, ragtag booksellers and party crashers like me as if they were fit to rub elbows with some of the most famous writers in the world. When Bill took a shine to you, he went all the way, and there was nothing he wouldn't do for a friend. He gave the greatest literary introductions I've ever heard. If this memorial wasn't for Bill Corbett, he'd be hosting it. Imbued with the same attention and jazzy vigor he'd bring to his own poems and essays, after a particularly vigorous night of drinking, he brought me an expensive sweater, just because. When it was time for the Red Sox to win the World Series, the first time, of course, I traveled back from Boston, on the bus from the Fung Wah, from New York to Boston, just in time for Bill and I to catch the final clinching, triumphant game. 9 Columbus Square was second only to Fenway Park in my imagination. Whether barreling down the Merritt Parkway at 100 miles an hour, jazz blazing, or shopping for cheese in the West Village, Bill always knew the best places to do and get everything. He lived for love, of poetry, of his family, of the good things in life. It's tough to imagine a world without Bill, but I don't have to. Most of the people I know and love, including almost everybody in this room, I know because of Bill Corbett. Even in just reaching out after his death, I've heard stories and been reminded of Bill in a million different ways. Bill's alive in us, those who knew him, those who love him, and the lives that he's changed. I still want to be Bill Corbett when I grow up, and I hope I do grow up. He's taught me a lot, even though I may not have learned quite enough, and his heart still beats loudly thumping in my life. And I know in all the lives he's touched. Wherever he was felt like the center of the universe, and right beside Bill was always the best seat in the house. Fortune cookie. Half moon over Fenway Park, over Vermont's sawtooth trees, one ear on the ball game, open book on lap, moths love tap the screen, the houses are empty. Wine calms the jets, mud settles, mind unclenches, unknots all who were here. Living is hard, art easier, throw strikes, walks always come back to haunt you. We've got a pretty amazing lineup of people who were important to Bill, his friends, his colleagues, the people that meant the most to him in the world. Not everyone, but some of them. And we'll have another chance in this next room for other people to speak. First, please welcome Bill's grandson, Thelonious Frumkin.
I want to start by thanking you all for coming. I know it would mean so much to him to have you all here with us. We are here to celebrate William Corbett, but I never knew him by that name. From the beginning, I called my grandfather Big. As an infant, I stubbornly referred to both my grandparents as Grandpa. In an attempt to get me to differentiate the two, my aunt once referred to them as Big Grandpa and Tiny Grandpa. It stuck, though it was soon shortened to Big and Tiny. This should come as no surprise to anybody that knows our family, as we have a fondness for nicknames, many of which were created by Big himself. Starting with my immediate family, for example, I am Bobo, although my grandfather always referred to me as Thelonious. My brother Bruno is affectionately known as Brunji. My sister is Siri J. Licious. My stepfather Andrew is Angie. My aunt Arden has always been Udi. Big also gave nicknames to his friends and loved ones. His old friend John Sanger is The Wang. Jim Burley, Jimu. My cousin Nick, Question Boy. My mother's childhood friend Christy Thomas, Misty Christie. I could go on. So for the duration of my time up here, I'll refer to William Corbett as I always have and always will, as Big. But Big is just one of my grandfather's many nicknames. Babo, Guillermo, and another that Big used when talking about himself, the Kid. I always found this particular nickname amusing, but in truth, it really did describe him. While an intellectual and a professor, my grandfather could be incredibly juvenile and crass, in the best way possible. He would tell jokes about emperors named Who Flung Pooh, and books titled 3 Tracks in the Snow by the author One Hung Low. If you happened to be in the room with Big when he farted, you would end up being blamed as the culprit. He hoarded and refused to share candy, even with his grandchildren. To that same end, he would regularly be caught stealing said candy on Halloween and Christmas from his children and later grandchildren. He would recount his frat house days with countless drunken deek-house tales, most fueled by the deek-house go-to cocktail, the Stump Lifter, made with equal parts frozen lemonade and grain alcohol, in case you were curious. My grandfather loved nothing more than bringing people together at his dinner table. With the culinary talents of my grandmother, he hosted some legendary meals, many of which I was lucky enough to attend. At each dinner, he would artfully assign seating for everyone, raise his glass, and give a toast. Then he listened to what was being said, asked questions, told stories and bad jokes, broke balls, and was just an all-around wonderful person to have a meal with. He was a provoker of conversation, and often, but not always, was at the center of it. To be at a dinner with Big was always, for me, a memorable event. He truly made everyone at his table believe he wanted to know about them and what they had to say. Everyone felt welcome. His constant entertaining, organizing, and socializing led him to make many friends. And I was always in awe of just how many people my grandfather knew. Both my mother and I have similar memories of walking with Big in New York as young children. With each old friend or acquaintance he greeted, we both became convinced that he knew everyone in the world. His socializing was open and inclusive. Big's friends were of all ages and walks of life. He saw equal value in organizing Henry Peck's annual softball game as in Friday nights and drinks with Eddie B., another Big nickname, and the crew at Grafton Street. Big made us all a part of his life. He loved bringing his children, then his grandchildren, to all sorts of events: dinners, baseball games, poetry readings, galleries, and museums, even when we were all very little. He was never embarrassed by us and sincerely wanted us to meet his friends and share in his social circle. Taking such obvious pride in his family, he garnered a lot of respect from family and friends. In our family, Big was somebody you would always give up the seat at the head of the table for, a place where he was at his best. When he would eat dinner at our place in Vermont, all Big had to do was raise a finger, and the conversation paused long enough for him to hear the outcome of a play on the Red Sox game over the radio. He would lower his hand, and conversation would resume. His opinion and advice were widely sought by all those who knew him. He gave his undivided attention, such a great listener who would then always come up with a plan. Big was a gregarious social work, and at the same time, he was a very sensitive and emotional man. Sensitive enough to shed a tear reminiscing over an old pooch, and fiery enough to go on a tirade for saying LeBron James was better than the great Larry Legend. My grandfather was also a man of routine and superstition. Salt had to be thrown over one's left shoulder. Big would never walk under a ladder or split a pole, always knocked on wood. He kept talismans in the pockets of his jacket, one an armless and legless rubber gorilla. He believed in the medical, physical power of the curse of the great Bambino, and completely understood and appreciated an athlete's game day ritual, as he had his own version. Big started every day, no matter where he was, at getting a New York Times and a Boston Globe for the sports section, if possible. He would then bogart all the good sections until he was completely finished reading them, often causing a dust-up with family members. Every day he made himself the same breakfast of tea and toast, and he had 2 supper-time meals he could prepare in lieu of Tiny's absence: a salt burger or a frittata. Big truly enjoyed his regular trips to the post office and always knew the person who delivered his mail by name. When in Greensboro, where he spent every summer since his 20s, Big went to Willie's at 8 a.m. every morning, and Montpelier the first thing every Saturday, always bringing Nancy Pike when in residence, where he would shop at the same 3 stands at the farmer's market, first and foremost Pete's Greens, visit the same shops in town, and end the trip getting groceries and wine in the co-op. Big even sat in the same chair out on the lawn in the late afternoon pretty much every day of the summer. Generosity was always very important to my grandfather. He constantly declared, "I'm a river to my people," quoting Anthony Quinn as Adu Abu Tai in Lawrence of Arabia. And it was true. Big loved giving. Though often spontaneous, his gifts were always thoughtful and deliberate. He loved to share his interests and passions. I remember when I was 6 or 7 years old, he got my brother and I of Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns, all 3 Indiana Jones movies, and the classic Stagecoach. These were some of the best gifts I had ever received, becoming the films of my childhood. He really helped nurture our taste in movies, introducing us to every genre, new and old, giving us a real appreciation and sparking our passions. My grandfather generously extended far past his family and friends and community at large. Big wrote countless recommendations, gave fantastic introductions and toasts. My mother would joke he should be rented out for weddings and funerals. He shared his personal and professional connections and knowledge with all. He was always an excessive tipper, and if you came to his house for dinner, it was likely that you left with a book or 2 or 3. But Big's most generous quality was the fact that he truly felt and celebrated the joy and accomplishments of those he loved. My grandfather was, among many things, an excellent storyteller. My favorite story that he told me for the first time one night when I was around 5 years old and couldn't fall asleep. Big told me about his days at the summer camp he went to for only one summer, Camp Idlewild. In retrospect, I think the story was meant to illustrate how good I had it, but that was lost on me. Big started with the description of punishment at Camp Idlewild for bedwetting, which involved forcing the camper from their cabin and making them spend the rest of their night in their wet pajamas on a rock, holding their soiled bedding. I was shocked and intrigued that there was a time and a place where such punishments existed. Big also insisted some of his former campers were sons of South American drug lords who had stacks of cash, guns, and porno mags in their steamer trunks. These privileged thugs were said to have cheated the swim test by bribing a counselor to tie them to the rowboat and dragging them the length of the lake. But being the great storyteller that my grandfather was, he saved the best tale for last. The story of his escape from Camp Idlewild. My grandfather, with his accomplice Bucky Pete, snuck out one night with a daring plan to flee by water. Stealing a camp rowboat, they made a break for the not-so-distant shore and freedom. They got about halfway across the lake before they heard the roar of the camp speedboat Riot. With its siren blaring, the spotlight soon set on them. Big and Bucky were caught and dragged back to Camp Riot in defeat. After his first failed attempt, both boys' Charleston Chew privileges were revoked. The two, now with nothing left to lose, attempted another escape via rowboat. Again, they were caught by Riot in quick order. On the third attempt, aided by a windless night, my grandfather and his partner in crime made it to dry land, while the rest of the camp ate dinner. They were eventually apprehended on the road, attempting to hitch a ride to anywhere. Big and Bucky Pete were kicked out of Camp Idlewild unceremoniously upon their return. To add insult to injury, Big's parents were so mad they refused to pick him up, and he had to make the trip back by bus, then train, alone. We were lucky to be together as a family in Greensboro when Big passed. Kate Moses came that weekend and took care of us all, cooking every meal for our extended family. We sat in the kitchen house table for our first dinner without Big, all of us feeling the crater left in his absence. Instinctively, we started telling our favorite Big stories. It turned into a raucous night filled with food, liquor, and laughter. A Big night in a nutshell. I like to think of this memorial service as an extension of that night, that we are all sitting at that table. Some of Big's best friends will be speaking tonight, people I have the utmost admiration and respect for. I am honored to be the first to speak today and look forward to the stories they will tell. But let us not stop there. We will come together when the memorial is over, and let's celebrate Big as he so deserves to be celebrated, with humor and generosity. We should share our big stories with each other. I want to hear them all. Tonight, we should eat, drink, and laugh. Let us not focus on the loss of William Corbett, but on all the love, wisdom, and humor he brought to each of our lives. Thank you.
Please welcome August Kleinzahler. He's a terrific writer. He's one of the sweetest things to ever come out of the state of New Jersey. August Kleinzahler.
Not much sweet comes out of the state of New Jersey, including me, but it's all relative, I suppose. Bill Corbett loved the Irish sports pages, as many of you will know, actually more than anyone I've ever met. His letters almost invariably began with R.I.P., rest in peace, followed by the name of a deceased football or baseball player, Dick Modulewski, Whitey Herzog, Allie Sherman, Eddie Stanky. Bill was a great sports fan, especially keen on his G-men, the New York football Giants and Red Sox, and every fall would like matching wits, picking NFL games with an intermittently homeless acquaintance of mine who called himself the Bhagwan of Bahesh. The Bhagwan regarded himself as something of a football seer, an avocation he took on every autumn as gridiron prognosticator for anyone who would pay attention. He was a prickly character, the Bhagwan, who over time developed a contentious relationship with Bill and vice versa. The Bhagwan had something of a drinking problem, among a variety of other problems, and divided his time between our neighborhood bar, Finnegan's Wake, and the psychiatric hospital up the hill at UCSF, Langley Porter, where he was tended to by the psychiatrist and eminent jazz pianist, Danny Zeitlin. The good doctor could not have been more solicitous of his charge, allowing regular visits from the Bhagwan's alarmingly young Filipino lady friend, Chacalita Villanueva. The Bhagwan every Saturday night would hand Chacalita his Sunday NFL picks, and she would then walk them down the hill and slip them through my mail slot before dawn. Turned out, Bhagwan was not so oracular or even reliable in his picks, which weekly I shared with Bill. Bill was not shy in voicing his contempt for the Bhagwan's purported expertise, and whose unkind remarks, to my discredit, I always shared with the Bhagwan, who in turn would become greatly incensed. So I was more than a little surprised when the bagman, as Bill and I called him, became completely unmoored after I conveyed the news of Bill's death this past August, just as the NFL season was getting underway, and checked himself into the Langley Porter Institute, where he has not been seen or heard from since. I think I know what the Bhagwan must have been going through. We both suddenly had enormous holes in our lives, a hole, frankly, that I suffer with every day, even 6 months later. I think many of us gathered here today find ourselves in that same predicament. And in most every instance, without the consolation of Thorazine or the ministrations of Dr. Zeitlin or Chacalita Villanueva. It's been a difficult 18 months. If I were to document Bill's every kindness, act of generosity, encouragement, hospitality, shared enthusiasm, and the rest over the past 30 some odd years or so, I'd overstay my welcome up here several times over. And you'll have heard and will be hearing about all that this afternoon from others. So let me just say that I've never met a man who enjoyed his life as much as Bill Corbett. And it was a long, astonishingly productive life as a teacher, poet, publisher, essayist, host of scores of writers, artists, musicians, loving, attentive husband, father, grandfather, the most loyal and devoted of friends. As a poet, essayist, editor of wonderful compendia like Literary New York and Literary New England, and a superb memoir, Furthering My Education, Bill's work never received anything like the kind of attention it deserved. A large part of that, I believe, was because he was so busy promoting the work of others, he couldn't be bothered with tooting his own horn. And he was one of the great readers aloud of poetry and on occasion prose, his own and others, in a sort of incantatory style that really laid it out there and seemed to be emphatically saying, dig this. Bill was always stimulating company and tremendous fun to be around, to hang with, in his living room or on a long drive to the Northeast Kingdom or down to New York, yakking away, listening to Harry Sweets Edison trade solos with Ben Webster and Lester Young, or visiting galleries and museums. Time spent with Bill always seemed to fly by. Bill loved his life and the world he created around himself, populated by the people he most enjoyed having around him, along with the activities that most delighted him, whether shopping for food and wine or visiting artist studios or organizing dinners and readings. And he succeeded in making all of us who crossed his path experience and share more than a bit of that love. It was contagious. He enhanced our lives, not just through his writing, teaching, formal and informal, never pedantic, sharing his excitement about whatever author or artist or jazz musician he was mad about at any moment, but just by the way he was in the world and conducted his life. Wine, talk, music, politics, Whitey Bulger, whatever. It was always free-flowing, genuine, and abundant. Bill was a civilized man in the best and broadest sense. And also the most generous, non-judgmental of men as well. He seemed to hold no grudges and spoke ill of no one or almost no one. He disapproved of frauds and opportunists, and there were those he felt had let him down, but seldom felt obliged to call anyone out on account of it. The Bhagwan, perhaps the one exception. Just two 2 weeks or so before he received his bleak diagnosis at Sloan Kettering. In the spring of 17, Bill and I, and my wife Marcy, whom Bill and Marnie hooked me up with and actually married in his Parkside living room, that's what I call a full-service friendship, enjoyed one of our best times together, the three of us visiting Chicago. Bill and I giving readings, taking in the new wing of the Chicago Art Institute, taking a frigid architectural boat tour, hanging with friends. Then, upon our return to the East Coast, Bill and Beverly hosted a book party for me at their home, and their place was packed. Packed. Certainly not for me, who would be hard-pressed to draw more than my wife and a couple of her girl buddies to a book party in San Francisco or New York, but because it was Bill and Beverly's, the house was packed. Plenty of drink and marvelous food on tap, as one always got with Beverly in charge. It could hardly have been a merrier month of May, our friendship in glorious bloom. And then the dreadful news. A couple of days before Bill died, where he would have chosen to die, in the wonderfully airy outbuilding he used for his writing and reading, looking out on Caspian Lake and Stannard Mountain, surrounded by family, friends, pets, those dearest to him. I spoke to Bill briefly on the phone. He was still lucid, but short of breath. I said, "Bill, you'll never guess who I have here with me." "Who's that?" he asked. I said, "The Bhagwan." "The Bhagwan," Bill said with genuine surprise. "What's the Bhagwan got to say about the upcoming season?" Bill asked. "He says Brady's toast. He's finished." "Brady's finished," the Bhagwan said. "Brady's done?" "Correctamento," I replied. "Truly and utterly, the Strumpatriots are fucked." There was a pause, and Bill said, with more animation than I would have thought he could summon under the circumstances, "I agree." "Tell the Bhagwan I agree." Rest in peace, William Corbett.
Please welcome Pete Johnson. Pete's a farmer from Vermont, and he's known Bill since he was a boy. Pete Johnson.
I first met Bill as a 12-year-old. I moved to Greensboro, near where they all summer, and Bill welcomed me and my siblings to use their beach. And he was Bill the poet to us, this eccentric summer person that came and then left and came back and left, and he was very generous to us and fun to be around. And then I didn't have much contact with Bill over the next 10 years or so as I grew up and was doing other things, and I started a farm. I have a vegetable farm in the next town over. And so then I had food, and Bill was attracted to food. So we sort of rekindled our friendship and got to know each other better. And Thelonious mentioned the Montpelier Farmers Market. So I used to sell food at the market there. And Bill would show up and start shouting my name when he was leaving his car in the parking lot. "Pete! Pete!" And this is 100 yards away from where I have a line, I have people I'm doing, change and this and that. And as he got closer, he'd start to heckle me. Whatever it was that day he was going to pick on me about, he'd start in. 50 yards away, the heckling would start. And then the whole time he's in my stand, he's trying to distract me from dealing with my other customers. And everybody's like, who is this guy? What's going on here? But it was really fun, and that was sort of a good example of our relationship. We were mutually antagonistic, teasing each other, bugging each other all the time. I'm sure I'm not unique in this room describing a relationship that way. I've been fortunate to not have a lot of people I'm close to die yet in my life, and watching Bill go was really hard. because, as been mentioned here, he's one of the more lively people any of us will ever know. And he just enjoyed life so much that, seeing that come out of him was really hard for me. One positive in that whole thing is I've gotten to know Bev better. And, Bill was a powerful personality, and I didn't know Bev very well before. And since he got sick, we've had some nice conversations about real things, and I look forward to continuing that. It's been a very special thing for me to be part of. Watching the family deal with Bill's illness was a real model for me. It wasn't, easy or perfect by any means, but talk about coming together and doing the best they could. Really, I hope that when I have family members that need that sort of care, we're able to do the same thing. My best last Bill memory was 2 days before he died. My wife Eloise and my daughter Bea and I were sitting in his library in Greensboro with Bev, and I liked to sort of play dumb with Bill sometimes, though that wasn't hard with a guy that smart. You didn't have to really pretend to be dumb. So I don't know what I said. Something about something. He's lying there, he's weak. He can barely talk. He's on the sofa, and whatever I said got him agitated. So he tries to elevate himself. His arm comes up. He's yelling the best he can. He's like informing me of my my juvenile ignorance. And this goes on for a minute or two, and then he sort of collapses back, although he wasn't actually up at all. He just settles back and goes quiet. And Bev says she was watching him, and a minute or two later he started to smile. And to me, that's my Bill. To the end, he was fighting for it, and I miss him an awful lot. And he's somebody who just went too soon, and it's nice to be part of everybody here and see some of the rest of his life. And thank you.
Please welcome Kathy Simon. She's a dear friend, and she's married to Michael Palmer. Kathy Simon.
Well, I decided a little bit to go rogue, so I invited Michael Palmer to be part of this also. Bill was a curator of friendship, the best friend, as we all have said and will continue to say, any of us would be ever lucky enough to have. Michael's here because he and I shared a friendship of over 50 years with Bill and Beverly, and later Marnie and Arden, and now the family. Bill was so important to both of us. So I would like to begin with a few of Bill's own words about being a friend. No one could say this better. He was a true expert. This is from Bill. Given the number and variety of friends in my life, you'd have reason to think that I might have some insight into the nature of friendship. Of course he did. I'm not sure that I do, at least nothing original about this mysterious bond not everyone enters into, and some do only rarely. A reason for this is that while I have clear memories of being attracted to certain people, I don't remember who I was or what I thought at the time, besides wanting to be their friend. I know I was quickly in pursuit, worked to impress them, to befriend them, and I know that I am the one who makes friends out of a need for friendship. That says no more than others have said. To make a friend, you have to be a friend. I love the beginnings of friendship, how fresher, brighter, funnier we are when we meet someone, and obviously we continue being fresher, brighter, and funny as we go along, but he wasn't giving himself credit for that. We want to know those who want to know us. If you have your guard up, you drop it and open up. Saul Bellow remarked laughingly that if two Americans meet one another and say in Paris, in half an hour they both will be letting their hair down. I don't know if I've ever been that American. I know I keep many things to myself, but I do know that I'm not one of those intelligent men who come drifting. I made a beeline for those I wanted to befriend. Nothing casual, no drift in me. Each friendship has its course, no matter how intense at the start. Some have a warranty that runs out quickly, and a few, like all of you, last a lifetime. Friends are scattered like stars or rain, some fixed and enduring, others pass like summer showers. There are patterns, but each friendship is a story in itself.
He was very possibly the worst driver I've ever known. Hunched over the wheel, 70 miles an hour, 2 feet behind the car in front. Also the most eager driver and the most generous, and he got us there with anecdotes and family sagas, light and dark, to spare. Boston to Manhattan many times to party with friends, see art, hear music and readings, and once to meet up with Bob Creeley and others at Max's Kansas City, where Warhol was passively presiding over the usual suspects from his crowd. Not for me, really, not finally for Bill either, I suspect, but we played it out together as best we could. He better than me. Not for me, really. A road, though, a ribbon of anecdotes that Bill traveled with enthusiasm and a singular raucous dignity. Greensboro, Columbus Square, and Brooklyn in the last years, highways and back roads. Stop sign meant go, one way meant either way. Red meant green, drive, he said, for Christ's sake, look out where you're going. And the darkness did surround us at times, as well as the light.
My own personal friendship with Bill flowered when he and Beverly moved from Boston to New York, Brooklyn. During the 6 years Bill lived at 375 Parkside Avenue, I traveled to New York with some frequency, partly for my architectural practice and partly to see our daughter Sarah, her husband Dylan, and eventually our grandson Nico, and later Jasper. Jasper was born when Nico and I were at the Corbetts. I was sitting arm in arm with Beverly and received the call that a brand new person had entered the world. Bill and Beverly embraced all of them, welcoming them into their family, into their circle. And when I was in New York, I made it my business and deepest pleasure to see Bill, and in his insightful and passionate company to look at art. Art was very important to Bill. He knew so much about it, had so many ideas about it, and they were so valuable to me. I sought out his advice regarding the essays I was writing, which he offered with his enthusiastic generosity, insights, and creativity. Bill's appreciation and embrace of the visual arts and poetry were personal, passionate, and encompassing. On a memorable day in 2016, we spent an afternoon at the Met Breuer's provocative inaugural exhibition, Unfinished, Thoughts Left Visible. Throughout Bill's engagement with the arts are his thoughts and life left visible.
Winter of 1968-69, Bill called to ask whether he could come over and watch the hockey playoffs on our new 17-inch Zenith black and white, purchased at Lechmere Sales in order to watch the moon landing. I had thought it has come, I'd never had a TV, but I thought if the only way you get to see the moon landing is on television, maybe it's time to have one. Hadn't thought of the playoffs. He arrived with champagne and stout to be combined, it was understood. The mighty and haughty Montreal Canadiens, les habitants, were to take on the relatively ordinary Boston Bruins, whose one ace was the very young rising star, Bobby Orr. That night the Bruins won, due to the otherworldly efforts of Orr, who seemed to play on a higher plane than mere mortals, smarter, faster, even stronger. So it was a given that Bill had to return for the following games, arriving at the same time with the same clothes on, beer and stout in hand, or champagne and stout in hand. Eventually, of course, the Canadians prevailed, 4-2, I believe. But this hardly mattered. Well, it mattered a bit to Bill, and therefore to us. In the years following, when Kathy and I had moved to the West Coast, I still felt myself fervently hoping for the Boston teams to win, knowing what it meant to Bill, the downtrodden Red Sox above all. And in his last decade, they indeed did win a World Series, and then another, and then another. And we were all happy for him, and to no small degree relieved. And I am happy for him now, for what he has left us that is inexpressible.
Bill loved this poem, which was a translation by Ezra Pound of Lee Poe's Exile's Letter. And before the end of the day, we were scattered like stars or rain. And if you ask how I regret that parting, it is like the flowers falling at spring's end, confused, whirled in a tangle. What is the use of talking? And there is no end of talking. There is no end of things in the heart.
I just want to end with a little fragment from a review of Bill's 1995 poetry collection, New and Selected Poems, that Zolan published in '95, and then a brief poem of Bill's. I really wrote the review partly so that I could sneak in the name of Ludwig Wittgenstein, knowing that Bill would be astonished to be included in a text with Ludwig Wittgenstein. This I did, but I will not quote that part of it. His work takes its place in some very generous company indeed. I think of the immediately preceding poetic voices he has learned from and continues to converse with: James Scholar, Philip Whalen, Elizabeth Bishop, Frank O'Hara, Robert Creeley, Laureen Niedecker, among others. Perhaps we should add two specifically Bostonian poets, John Wheelwright and John Wieners. More significantly, it is impossible to think of Corbett alone in this book or this room. It is far too densely and far too generously peopled for that. It reminds us that the play of the visible, even the familiar, is endless in its reach, as is the play of language. This little poem of Bill's I thought to finish with. It's called Morning Papers. Eyebrow moon canted sets as I rise to work in other people's words, while around me lie books unread. My pen dips through the heap and the morning passes. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Fred Moten. He's a wonderful writer and poet and a great friend of Bill's. Fred Moten.
I had so many great times with Bill, as I know everybody in here did too. I was thinking this morning about the time when he was working on New York Literary Lights, and I had just moved to New York, and so he took me on a little walking research tour with him to see the Cedar Tavern and Edna St. Vincent Millay's extraordinarily thin house. And he dropped me off, or I dropped him off at Kenward Elmsley's house. And I think about one time my best friend Stephen Harney and I were standing outside a Harvard bookstore, and something whirred past us on a bicycle going against the traffic on Mass Ave. And we just heard this voice go, "Steve, Fred." And then I think about the time a few years ago when Bill came to Los Angeles, and we had just moved to a new house, and we had this really cool backyard, which, you know, we were pretty happy about. But Bill was much more enthusiastic about it than us, particularly for our kids, and he just looked at me and said, "Fred, it's a world." And I looked and I said, yeah, it is, it is. And I guess really I woke up this morning trying to understand how all that could happen. Where did this guy come from? How did it happen? And I think the closest thing I could come to an answer for is that he was just good. Goodness isn't perfect, and it's, I think it's actually radically imperfect, and it's radically committed to imperfection. And it's not virtue either, because it's not prim like that. And it's not antithetical to virtuosity, but command over technique is like an embellishment for it and not the essence of it. I'm convinced every time I hear Louis Armstrong play that he's a great musician because he was a good person. It just feels like it comes through the horn like that, with that level of brightness and intensity. And just like Bill, I believe he was a great poet because he was just a good person. He shared rather than dampened your enthusiasm. He noticed really deeply rather than overlooking, or even worse, looking shallowly and too quickly. And above all, he welcomed rather than excluded. All this is so simple that it's all but impossible. And so ordinary that it's extraordinarily rare. And when you have someone like that and then lose them, it's unbearable until you start to consider how ridiculously lucky you were to have had someone like that at all. So really, I'm just here to say thank you to Bill and to Beverly and Marnie and Arden, Thelonious, Bruno, Siri Jane for sharing. It's just been a wonderful 35 years having him in my life. And I asked Arden before I did this, because I know I'm breaking protocol and bringing some black church into St. Mark's. But if you just can imagine for a minute that this is Boston Garden, and imagine that Larry Bird is just coming off the floor after having put up a triple-double. And note that when I said that Bill was good but not perfect, one of his most fundamental imperfections was this irrational love for Larry Bird that many people, that I don't really understand. But if you can imagine for a minute Larry Bird coming off the floor, but then remember that we're actually talking about Bill, who's way, way better, join me right now in giving him a standing ovation.
That triple-double was against the Lakers, right? Please welcome Fannie House. She's a wonderful writer and a wonderful friend of Bill's.
When I read Bill's poems without him being anywhere anymore, I read them doubly, both as strangers who, when alive, I failed to greet with adequate enthusiasm, and also as messages from a soul I do recognize, but better yet, understand and love, poems that don't ask much in the way of a heated response, They exist as the branches and water exist, catching words in their shapes and images in their reflections. In 1967, we went together to hear Basil Bunting read Brig Flats, and Bill's joy on that occasion left me with the impression that this rapturous Orphic verse would carry him along through the years. It did. This poet from Northeast England, who composed with a mallet out of speech itself, welded to the lyric beat, stayed with Bill. I think he took this direction despite all the American experiments and digressions, and even the marvelous prose that he wrote so modestly. I don't want to reduce his aspirations too much, but only to pass along that one memory that shines on me today. And the two lines that everybody who knows Brig Flats at all are the right words for me thinking about Bill. Brag, sweet tenor bowl, descant on Rothy's madrigal.
Please welcome Tim Watkins. He's a family friend, and he's known Bill his whole life. Tim Watkins.
First, I'd like to thank Bev and Marnie and Arden for having me. You've made a huge mistake. When Beverly called to tell me Bill had passed, I was working just a few blocks from Fenway Park, renovating the world's smallest kitchen. I put down my tools, left the tiny kitchen, wandered across the fence, and found a bright red plastic Adirondack chair, put there by the MFA for anyone looking to spend some time with a 10-foot-tall bronze baby head. I sat for a while, just me and the baby head, and took some time to try to imagine a world without Bill. The coat closet kitchen and the big bronze baby head stick with me now, not merely for the shock I was in, but also because for me, there was no one better than Bill to share life's absurdities with. You might as well have been feeding him. A kitchen so small even a poet could afford it, a big bronze Don Zimmer-looking baby head, scrambling my thoughts as I try to pull them together. So many silly things, so often so dumb, and now so sorely missed. This was our friendship of the last 2 decades. Get together, talk about the things that mattered to us. There we go. And plenty more that did not. Eat, drink, hang out, then get back in motion, maybe drive the dirt roads around Greensboro on made-up errands. More cheese from the boys, more beer from the beer man up on the hill. I've already shared much of this with Bev, Marnie, and Arden, but I guess the reason I'm here now is to share with all of you what a powerful, life-sustaining, and effortless thing it was to have Bill as my lifelong friend. He is with me every day in how I think, how I see the world, what I laugh at, and how I try to make sense of things. I was lucky enough to know Bill my whole life. Growing up in Boston, he was one of my parents' oldest and closest friends. Our family's houses were only a few blocks apart, and always in motion, we were one of Bill's frequent stops. Here was this completely outsized, excitable, hilarious, irreverent force of nature forever at our kitchen table, perhaps with some saltines and a Rolling Rock in front of him, maybe some yelling going on at the Celtics or the Sox on the TV in the corner. And if it was the Celts, Bill never tiring of game caller and ex-Celtic great Bob Cousy yet again imploring the home team for less dwibbling and more penetration. And if he'd brought something with him for my folks, he'd be sure to wave off any thanks. As Theo said, reminding us yet again, Ben, Judy, you know I am as a river to my people. I knew he was mocking some cornball movie line, but I was also learning something important about how Bill would live his life. On the move, bearing gifts, but always with time to get into it with friends, or friends of friends. Of course, as a kid, I couldn't know then that I had made a very, very special friend. How would I know that the world is not full of Bill Corbetts? Or how few people there are who, since our last conversation, would have tracked down just the book to get me up to speed on Honus Wagner, Jerry Lee Lewis, Bill Russell, or Philip Marlowe. And across the decades, there were, of course, the dinners. Before each one, Bill, feet together, leaning slightly forward, guiding you with the crazy Bob Dole hands to your assigned seat at the table. Part matchmaker, part social disruptor. And when did he come up with these combinations? And did he ever completely blow it? I should have asked him. For a man who did his fair share of talking, Bill was a better listener, always making you feel that your take on the world was indispensable to him. And by constantly weaving you into his circle of smart, witty, stylish friends, he gave you the chance to think you might be some of those things too. A few years ago, Bill and I took on the job of doubling up or sistering the undersized floor joists of the boathouse bedroom in Greensboro. The boathouse is quite old and lightly built. Feeling the floor flex beneath you as you climbed into a bed that was already hanging out over a lake had become too thrilling for some guests. It took a few days. Bill was my 70-something apprentice, helping me install large timbers overhead. But I think the real job for him was to mine my brain for insider knowledge, the names, weights, and aptitudes of different tools, the scandalous story of how the Phillips head screw, with nothing to recommend it, had sent all the other fasteners packing. But physically, I had underestimated my friend, forgotten the extra Bill Corbett gear, the energy that buzzed off him his entire life. The boathouse joists are now plenty stiff. A few years later, sitting with the big baby head, it all came rushing into my head. Unique among the friends I've had, Bill had committed himself long, long ago to putting the full force of his very forceful being, without ever being asked, behind anything I did or against anything blocking the road ahead of me. A very, very special friend. I was really counting on a few more decades of Bill's friendship. And for that, I am terribly disappointed. I love that man. I miss him. And I wish he was here to do something about this seating plan. Wave the funny hands. Tell us all where to sit. Thank you.
Next is Ron Padgett. He's a wonderful poet and writer and a great friend of Bill's. Please welcome Ron Padgett.
this is wonderful, being here with all of you, celebrating Bill. It's really, really something. About 24 years ago, Bill and I were invited to give a poetry reading up in Vermont in St. Johnsbury. And the host said, why don't you two guys introduce each other? And we thought that was a cool idea. And so I approached the podium first and to introduce Bill. And I actually have the remarks that I said then. I'm going to read them back to you. When Bill Corbett and I agreed to introduce each other tonight, we did not anticipate a major drawback to this arrangement. Namely, we would not be able to praise each other lest it appear to be blatant back-scratching. And so, we are constrained to stifle our encomiums and stick pretty much to the facts. There is, however, a certain logic to this symmetrical arrangement. Bill and I were both born in 1942. We both teach writing. We both edit. We both recently published books called New and Selected Poems. And we've written non-fiction books about our fathers. Both of us have been extremely fortunate in our respective marriages with fantastic wives and children. The two of us love this state of Vermont, having spent a combined total of between 50 and 60 summers here. And we're old friends. And then I went on and I mentioned some titles of Bill's books, very sort of dryly listing them, and trying not to say anything favorable about them. And finally, I got down to the end, and I just spontaneously said, you know what I said about restraining myself? To hell with it. Bill Corbett is a terrific guy and a terrific writer. Now, 4 years before that reading, in 1992, Bill and Beverly came down to, in Vermont, from Greensboro, to visit Kenward Elmsley in Calais, Vermont, where I and my wife were, and Joe Brainerd was there as well, and Ann Lauterbach was a house guest there. And the occasion was that both Bill and Beverly and Ann and Joe Brainerd and myself were all turning 50 at almost the same time. And we went outside Kenward's house in the back and sat on a bench, side by side, and we all turned, and my wife took a photograph of us. And it was one of the shining moments of my life, I have to say. And every time I see that photograph, I think how lucky I was to sit there on that bench with those people. Now, over the summers, we developed, someone mentioned Bill's love of ritual. We developed a ritual whereby Bill would send me a postcard. It was only a few miles away, really, but he would send me a postcard which invariably began, "Dear Burger Boy," in reference to the fact that we would get together and drive over to nearby village of Plainfield, where we would have lunch. We started out having lunch at a place called River Run Cafe, which they had wonderful hamburgers there. And so we would both order a hamburger, and that's how I became Burger Boy. But then when River Run closed for a while, we went next door to a funky old pizzeria called Positive Pie, and then I became Pizza Boy. And the thing about these get-togethers was Bill would drive down from Greensboro and pick me up at noon, and I always insisted on noon. And the great thing was that Bill arrived at noon, exactly. And I'd hear his car come up, and I would walk out onto the deck and look down at the dooryard, and there was Bill waving at me and approaching with a book in his hand or something he had brought invariably to give me and my wife. And then we would drive together. Sometimes I would take a deep breath and allow him to drive me to Plainfield. And other times I would insist on driving. And we would drive very slowly on the back roads. I mean, we'd drive like 20 miles an hour the whole way because it made the ride last longer. And we would invariably start gossiping, mainly about our friends. But the gossip was more like exchange of news, never malicious on Bill's part, that is. But it was Bill seemed to know everything. I mean, he seemed to know who all our friends were, what they were doing, and what they were publishing, and where they were living, and where they were now in Paris. It was amazing. I couldn't believe he knew all this stuff. But the same people I knew, but I didn't know any of that stuff. And then we would get to the cafe, and as someone said, we always had an argument as to who was going to pay. And I would say, but Bill, you paid last time. And no, you paid last time. So we finally figured out just whoever would shove the other one out of the way fast enough to get the money, that was it. That was the way we paid. Another sign of Bill's endless generosity. And then after that, we would walk half a block to a 19th century village house, 2 stories, funky, rambling place, which housed a place called the Country Bookshop. It's still there, and run by a wonderfully amiable fellow, and who greeted us and knew Bill, of course. And there were 60,000 books in this old bookstore, and it was an old-fashioned place. So we would head back to the poetry section, which was pretty generous, and there you would find a book by Michael Palmer next to a book by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And you never knew what you were going to find. It was always wonderful. And I would look around, and we would make irreverent jokes about the different books and their authors. It was so much fun. There was nobody else in the store, and we would be shouting at each other. It was great. Bill would wander around to some other section, and I would still shout, and we would shout back and forth over the bookshelves. And it was so much fun. I got to say, it was so much fun. Then, finally, one of us would say, hey, you about ready? And we would go up to the cash register. I'd be carrying one slim plaquette for $1.50. Bill would have an armload of books, and I couldn't believe it. And I'd say, Bill, I used to say, I stopped asking, what are you going to do with all those books? He said, I can give this one to Marnie. I can give this one to so-and-so. He had bought them for other people, and maybe something for himself. So again, I'm just echoing my own pathetic way of things that have been said here earlier before. But the thing about Bill, I just liked him as a guy. Not only as a writer, but as a guy. I felt very happy to be with him, and I trusted him. Now, of course, everyone has already pointed out that he was a great man of letters. He was an editor, wonderful editor and publisher of books and magazines. He curated a reading series in Boston. In fact, he was the poetry man in Boston. And he wrote wonderful art criticism, his book on Guston and all the essays and art catalogs. His memoir of his father is a phenomenal book. And he was an essayist and a wonderful poet. And he was a fundraiser for needy poets. There were a couple of times he organized projects to raise money for 2 poets who really were in desperate need of money. And Bill just came up with this wonderful idea, to raise money. Now, of course, he loved art, writing, books, and people, but it turned out that I think that Bill's, one of his primary missions in life, without his perhaps knowing it or thinking about it, was to bring all these things together. And because he had, as you know, an easy sociability, he had a wonderful sense of humor, and he really did care about other people. And so in doing that, he actually created a kind of community in which good writing mattered both as an artistic force, but also as a moral force. And in all this, he was very much his own man, but there was also this shining altruism and selflessness in all of it. And like so many of you, I was lucky to be his friend.
Next is Bill's friend, Roland Peace. Roland was a wonderful publisher of Bill's work and a dear, dear friend. Please welcome Roland Peace.
I first met Bill Corbett through his poems. He sent me his manuscript on Blue Note in the late 1980s for publication at Zolan Books. And having read through the poems 3 or 4 times, both out loud and silently, I jumped at the chance to publish them. I was struck by his voice, always his voice, which was clear and full and mesmerizingly musical. I was taken. That was the beginning of our long path together. Over the next 10 years, I published 7 books of Bill's, 3 collections of poems, 2 memoirs, and a collection of reviews and essays. A few of my fondest memories with Bill took place at Fenway Park, rooting on our Red Sox, but also at the Regatta Bar and Scullers Jazz Clubs in Cambridge, hearing Don Byron, T.S. Monk, Charlie Hunter, Leon Parker. And we also, believe it or not, attended a boxing match together. He was fun to be with at times like that. We also went to museums as well, and Bill's examined art unlike anyone else I had ever known. Of course, we went to a dozen of poetry readings, and once we read together at the Victoria Monroe Gallery on Newbury Street in Boston. One night at Fenway Park in 2004, that historic year in Red Sox history, the year the Red Sox won it all, Bill, Ed Barrett, and I went to a game. Near the end, a voice came on over the loudspeaker announcing that fans who wanted to stay in the park after the game was over were welcome to do so, as a scene from the movie Fever Pitch, starring Drew Barrymore and Jimmy Fallon, would be filmed. And cheering was required. When the game ended, Bill said his goodbyes to us. And when I asked him if he wasn't going to watch the filming, he looked at me askance. One of those looks. He could scoff with the best of them. And off he went. And I remember keeping my eyes on him as he moved through the crowd, a man I loved and respected. Before I read 2 short poems by Bill, I want to share another memory. Last spring, Beverly read my memoir in progress to Bill. He could no longer read for himself, but he wanted to weigh in on my work. He was eager to hear the first 200 pages or so. But he was not able to articulate the way he once could. I was very touched that he tried. I wasn't able to decipher all that he tried to say to me, but one bit of advice came through. He said, "Put more music into it." I didn't ask him to elaborate because I knew that that would be hard for him to do, but I took his statement 2 ways. He knew music was critical to me, that I went to hundreds of concerts over the years. So did he want me more details about the concerts I attended, from Monk to Nina Simone to The Clash to Theodorakis? Maybe. Or perhaps he meant my sentences needed to sing more. Either way, he got me thinking, as he always did. There's a line Bill wrote in a poetry review that appears in All Prose, and I think it's a good way of introducing Bill's poems. It reads, "A real poem is always in the right and only words." Hero, Miles, Birdland, 1959. At first he wasn't there. Kelly, Cobb, Chambers, Cannonball, chorus after chorus, until he strolled on stage and turned his back to us. Jacket fit like a box. Soloing, he crouched into his horn, then walked off on the applause, turned blue. So cool, would take his shit for a sacrament. The Painters. de Kooning, Jack the Dripper, Guston, Klein, Life prints your paintings, Excavation, Mahoning, Attar, Blue Poles, compelling me to the cellar where I brush house paint on wood scraps and shingles. Dream of youth there to see instantly ridiculous. But the feeling, the freedom, the charge in your work is there to this day. Bloom, Goldberg, Hartigan, Mitchell, Leslie, Held. Book spread open on lap. How deep my pleasure, like swimming underwater, not wanting to come up. America accelerates so fast. The world we dream of living in, we grow up to discover is our past. 50s world of us and them. Painters celebrated for poverty today, celebrated for wealth. Their New York a dream ripening to a memory. Mine, blind Gary Davis, 12 Gates to the City, Bob Dylan, astronaut splash on TV in every store window. Crepe dressed JFK death, 10th Street, the Cedar Bar history. As quickly past New York of my youth. Remember another life photo, Air Force Officer Shoup, used to test G-force, strapped to a railway car and fired like a bullet. Up close of his wrenched and rubbery, painful grimace. We were all in the future before we knew it. Thank you, Bill.
Please welcome Paul Auster. He's a wonderful writer and a big friend of Bill's.
It's hard being last. This has been an amazing day. I think everything everyone has said has gone into me so deeply that I can barely speak right now. So it's been just overwhelming, and I am grateful for everyone to everyone for being here. All right, here's my little 2 cents. On August 10th last year, the Boston Red Sox came back from a 5-run deficit to the Baltimore Orioles and romped, as the sports writers used to say, to a decisive victory over the Birds by scoring 19 runs. The most runs they had scored in a single game all season, in fact, in many seasons. And because August 10th happened to be the day Bill died, and because Bill happened to be one of the most ardent Red Sox fans to be found anywhere across the wide expanse of the lower 48, I can only assume that Bill was responsible for that explosion of 19 runs. The heavens wept, but the Red Sox romped. And And if you are saying to yourself that Bill couldn't have been responsible, for how can a dead man be responsible for anything? I would counter by arguing that even if Bill himself couldn't claim credit for inspiring his team to score all those runs, then it was the ghost of Bill, or the spirit of Bill. For the truth is that the dead most certainly can and do affect what happens in the world. For now that Bill is no longer in the world, his death has changed us and continues to change us still. And for those of us who loved him, we now live in a different reality from the one we inhabited when Bill was walking among us. I don't know what to say. He was my friend for 44 years. That is, from my late 20s into my early 70s. And I still find myself struggling to face up to the altered reality of a world that no longer has Bill in it. I am not a simpleton. I know that people die, and have already watched dozens of my friends leave this world. And I know for a certainty that not one of them is ever coming back. But I still haven't fully understood that when the telephone rings, Bill will not be the person on the other end of the line. No, I am not being maudlin, just stating a fact. And because every one of us here knows that Bill was not only a friend, but a person with a rare talent for friendship, perhaps even a genius for friendship, I will not try your patience with stories about my particular friendship with Bill, or how my membership in the Brotherhood of Bill affected my life. Instead, I want to turn away from personal matters and focus on Bill the poet, Bill the writer, and read several of the poems he published in 2012, grief poems he wrote after the death of his friend Michael Gizzi. For the odd thing about these poems today is that they have doubled back on themselves and seem to stand as a memorial to Bill himself, as if they had been written by someone else about Bill, even though Bill is unmistakably the author, which makes the author both Bill and not Bill, Bill writing to us from the great beyond. Third and long, you die, and the already baffling world becomes more so. Letters no longer come, the computer I can't master. Then you leave us short another well-developed sense of absurdity. Beginning today, it is third and long. Nothing to do but go for it. Michael Gizzi must have been that love child of Dante Lavelli and Max Speedy, the Italian stallion Johnny Blood never dreamed of, up the gut, running clear in the broken field. He knew his playbook, his reads, mastered the stop and go, button hook, deep post, and how to drag his toe, both feet in bounds. Anarchic SOB, one tough hombre. Michael wanted to sting them a little, and he did. Hard on the world, hard on himself. Memorial reading for Michael Gizzi. One of our tribe will read too long. Check the time and continue on. If this doesn't happen, the night will be unmemorable. Like a wedding absent the drunk dentist on all fours barking. You went to sleep, didn't wake up. There is a joke in that, you alone could tell. One of our tribe will fuck up. That's what we do, memorably. Throw another poet's book at your head, you told me, like J.D. Reed wiping his ass on Arthur Freeman's cover photo. I regret not telling you that. This one ending, empty benefit and benevolent McCormick Theater, Brown. Pilar tearfully speaks. Many read crisply without scandal. Tom sings Snowplow, New England. At the close, you on tape. Back down empty streets, lights on upstairs where you sat, sharpening your axe for big timber, wondering if you were good or not. Some of us do. You were learning to cut your way through a wall of human flesh, dragging your canoe behind you. The ruder lines will survive. This one has a little epigraph from Joseph Mitchell. Quote, "Don't worry, honey, I'm just taking out the improvements." What was the last food tasted, the last music heard, last line read, last line written? We can only guess. The last laugh, punchline, chewing gum, holding back Clark Gable's ears? That's a wild guess. You gave up the ghost. What a phrase. And its meaning is, in sleep, drifting away as we all will, all fall down on the cock horse to Banbury Cross. There's no time to prepare for this, and now there's no stone on which your name is spelled. You must have had a middle name, Anthony, like the boy who ran through the North End answering his mother's call to dinner. Michael Anthony, yes, Mike Anthony John Beresford Tipton's factotum. Don't worry about death. We are never prepared, but nature will write a check for 1,000,000 years of peace. If you're sending a message, this is the one I've received. And then the last, March glare. Michael, I'll believe you're dead when you don't show up for Trevor's birthday dinner. It's March 26th this year. He'll be 66. We'll argue, as always, over how many years he's come to Boston to celebrate. 35? He missed the year his father died. Called on the phone. My dog is dead. Broke down and passed the phone to Billy, his dad. Trevor meant his dad had died. On the inside front flap of the book, Elegies for Michael Gizzy, Bill wrote, "You can get the facts of Michael Gizzy's life and more on the internet. From these you may guess that he was one of those generous souls who served poets and poetry." Again, without knowing it, or at least not consciously, Bill was writing about himself. A generous soul who served poets and poetry. Thanks.
Thank you for coming. Thanks to everyone who shared stories about Bill. Thank you to the Corbett family for sharing Bill with us all these years. We're going to have a toast to Bill in the next room, in the Parish Hall, in a few minutes, and I hope you'll join us. Like I said, thank you for coming. Thanks to everybody here at the Poetry Project. A wonderful event. Thank you very much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you know it, sing along. You feel inclined to cut a two-step, the dance floor is open. All right? Listen, I ain't scared of none of y'all. Don't know much about history. Come on. Don't know much biology. Don't know much about a science book. Don't know much about the French I took. But I do know that I love you. And I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful world this would be. Don't know much about geography. Don't know much trigonometry. Don't know much about algebra. Don't know what a slide rule is for. But I do know 1 and 1 is 2. And if this one could be with you, what a wonderful world this would be. Now I don't claim to be an A student, but I'm trying to be maybe by being an A student, baby, I can win your love for me. Don't know much about history. Come on and sing it. Don't know much biology. There you go. Don't know much about a science book. Don't know much about the French I took. But I do know that I love you. And I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful world this would be. Cha 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 cha. History, oh, biology, hey, a science book, la 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 la. The French I took, but I do know that I love you, and I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful world this would be. Thanks, Bobo.
Please join us at the Parish Hall for a toast to Bill. We'll be going to his tour. Thank you for coming.
I'll go up and see if she's anywhere in the back. Except if she was there.
Devil Dog.
They teach transitioning adults, the different IT stuff. They have job training, they're doing resume, so
Somebody might find it. I don't know if he ever wrote it. house years ago or what?